since the beginning of lockdown, and it will be our last one for a little while. I'm sure we'll be back. I'm not sure when, but it's great to have Jacques from Georgia State University with us. He's in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, and he's associate professor there. And he works on crimes against drug dealers is one of his particular interests, and looking at crime from the perspective of offenders. He's the editor of the International Criminal Justice Review, and he's currently co-editing with me, though Scott's doing all the work, a volume on Bentham's writings on police, and he's got a whole host of scholars to write short commentaries on the importance, significance, or on Bentham's writings on police, which date from the very end of the 18th century, from about 1798 to 99. Scott did publish a piece on Bentham in what might initially sound like the most, perhaps, it might take the prize for the most unusual place a serious piece on Bentham has appeared, which is the Journal of Drug Issues. That was last year on a piece entitled "Bentham Not Epicurus: The Relevance of Pleasure to Drug-Induced Pain." But and that's worth looking at. To see yet another dimension to Bentham's thought and his relevance. But today's paper is related to this book that Scott published with UCL Press, therefore it's open access and available to anyone to read. The title of it was "Grey Areas Regulating Amsterdam's Coffee Houses," and that was published last year. So that's by way of introduction, and now I'm looking forward very much to hearing Scott talk about deterrence and proterrence in Amsterdam's coffee shops. Thanks very much, Scott, for agreeing to talk to us, and it's over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Philip, and thanks, Tim, and hi, everyone. I can't see you, but I trust you're out there and very likely multitasking, so carry on, two birds, one stone. What am I talking about today? Well, I'm going to get into that, but let me tell you a little bit more about me first. So I am a huge Bentham fan. I always say if there was a bag of bones that I would like to have sex with, Bentham's it. He's just an amazing person, done amazing things. One of those figures in criminology that's at the same time everyone knows his name, but not everyone fully appreciates all of the things he did. And I would like to think that's probably because there's so many things he did. It's very difficult for anyone to know about all those things. And so my interactions with Tim and Philip and Michael Quinn have been really wonderful to learn from them, everyone else at the project. And if you're a criminologist out there, I really hope you'll look at what the Bentham Project does. This is my website in the upper left corner, scottjakes.us or Jacques or Jacques, I hear it all. Any of the above are fine. As Philip said, I'm an associate professor of criminology and criminal justice at Georgia State. I have a little nonprofit that I recently started called Criminology Open, and we're working to really increase open access to criminology, something that is very important. I think we're a little behind, well, a lot behind the hard sciences, and trying to catch up on that, and just education, making people more aware of best practices and things like that. So on my website, something you'll find is free versions, post-print versions of all of my articles, so that if you get paywalled out or a student gets paywalled out or anything like that, they're always free and available for everyone. So let's kind of start at the beginning of how did I get interested in Amsterdam's coffee shop. So growing up in America, they're very infamous. Everyone knows that you can smoke weed there. I always wanted to go, and I was studying abroad in Oxford for, I guess that would have been fall of 2003, and I had some spare money and I had a free weekend. So I took a flight from, I believe it was Heathrow to Amsterdam, showed up, didn't really know where I was going, but had a hostel in the center of town in the red light district. Went there, hung out at some coffee shops, saw what it was actually like, not just to see it on TV or hear about it from friends, but to actually experience it. And something I talk about in the book is, while it was enjoyable and fun, and this is kind of what I'm going to get into later, in a way it's actually very boring and mundane. It's like Vegas. Of once you're there for 2 or 3 days, it's okay, what am I doing? I can't really do this anymore. It's time to head home. And you see that a lot from hanging out in coffee shops for a couple of years. They seem very exotic and interesting. In a lot of ways they are, but at the same time, there's not a lot going on there in terms of crime and violence and disorder. Certainly not as much as you would find in the bars, for example, that you would find all across the globe. So in any case, back to the story, I went back from Amsterdam to Oxford, and then from Oxford home to Athens. That's AHN, and not the historic Athens, Athens, Georgia, which is home to the University of Georgia. And I started doing a project of young middle-class drug dealers who were my friends. And what I was really interested in them wasn't so much the motivation, which I more or less took for granted, or how they sell exactly in a kind of economic way, but I was especially interested in their victimization, and when they were victimized, how did they respond? And the reason this struck me is from reading the literature at the time, which was all new to me, but in some respects very like, again, the stereotypical things you would see on TV. They were not violent people. When they did engage in violence, it was laughably nonviolent, a few measly hits, nothing you would ever be proud to do, at least not in your teenage years. It was embarrassing for them to fight in many ways. And just their capabilities in that regard were very low. They didn't have guns, they didn't have serious injuries, they didn't grow up in this kind of environment. The stereotypical environment was being studied at the University of Missouri St. Louis, which is where I went to get my PhD. So went from Athens to St. Louis. And the idea, which I did, was to also interview a comparative group of drug dealers who were lower class, minority, to gain a on, are they really that different from the middle class we grew up with? And the answer is, in a lot of ways, no. In a lot of ways, yes. There's going to be overlap. So try to pinpoint those kinds of extreme, the kinds of similarities. That's what I did my dissertation on. This book focuses on the middle class dealers, but with the stereotypical dealers in the background, if you will. So around maybe a year and a half, the PhD program, all of my dissertation data was collected, and so I started thinking, well, what do I want to do next? And Amsterdam was really interesting to me. And the thing about Amsterdam, and that isn't as well researched in the drug area as you might think, is there's a lot of assumptions about if you're an illicit drug dealer, you can't call the cops. And because you can't call the cops, you're more likely to retaliate, you're more likely to be victimized, and things like this. So kind of a Hobbesian theory, or what a mentor of mine would refer to as, Mark Cooney would refer to as, virtual anarchy. So you're in a state of law, but you don't have good access to law. So all of these kinds of things go on. And so the thing about Amsterdam that struck me was, like any context, so let's say Atlanta, they had illicit drug dealers, street dealers, other kinds, and they had legal drug dealers, so bars selling alcohol, pubs, cafes. You could also do, if you wanted, I didn't do this, you could do pharmacies, and, in the United States and increasingly in Europe, there's more and more decriminalized dispensaries for marijuana, legalized dispensaries, things like that. So at the time, and again, this must have been 2007, I would say, what was interesting about Amsterdam and the Netherlands more broadly was they had this middle group on the legal continuum of not fully legal and not fully illegal, but in the middle. And so the idea was to go to Amsterdam and collect information, quantitative and qualitative, on victimization and social control among the dealers there. Street dealers, and this is all around the center of Amsterdam, street dealers, coffee shops, and bars. And I'll talk in a little while about what exactly the coffee shop law policy is. But first, to give you a sense of the study, I was right here, and you can see, hopefully, the color-coded area is known as the 1012 district of Amsterdam. So it's a postal code. It's the very middle. It's the most historical part. There's kind of a famous map that would flip this around, and that's the very center of Amsterdam that you're seeing here that I studied. It's about, as I recall, I want to say like a mile long, but don't quote me on that. And then there was this little area, if you look towards the top, that kind of shoots off to the left, that if you're coming into Amsterdam and you don't know better, was socially part of the 1012, and it had a lot of bars and it had a lot of coffee shops. And so for the sake of just increasing the possible population a little bit without going too outside the social context, we went ahead and added that street as well. So in any case, what I did there was I interviewed, as I maybe said, 50 coffee shops, 50 bars, 50 street dealers. How did I do that? I spent the first fall, this would have been 2008, walking around, creating population lists of coffee shops and bars. So literally walking multiple times, every little street segment in this area to record, is there a coffee shop? Is there a bar? Poke my head in, see, confirm this is that kind of place. Because there's if you don't know, a coffee house, HUIS, would be a coffee shop in the American sense, a Starbucks versus a coffee shop. That was always distinct, but at the time I just wanted to double check. And then bars and cafes, there was sometimes a thin line between, is it really a restaurant or is it a bar? So figure out those kinds of things. And then I compared those lists to online resources like Google, coffee shop directory, and then randomly sampled from that group. And so there was something around 80, I want to say 82, 85 coffee shops and near 250 bars. So we would randomly sample them, send them a letter. And them, I should say, by the way, are my colleagues, Richard Rosenfeld, Richard Wright at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. They were both there at the time. And then Frank van Gemmert at Free University of Amsterdam. So randomly sample, send them a letter, go talk to them, tell them what we're doing, why we're there. We offered them 50 euros. They agreed we would do an interview meaning a very fixed quantitative survey that also had qualitative follow-up questions. So for example, how many times has someone tried to pay counterfeit money? And then you get that count, and then you would ask, okay, will you tell me about the most serious time, like a 100 euro bill versus a 50 euro bill versus a 20 euro bill, and then also the most recent time, to try to gain those details that may be useful for understanding what's going on. And I'm going to focus today on the qualitative data. I also did 50 street dealers, and originally the plan, if you've been to Amsterdam back then, it's changed a lot, was the street dealers would walk around and say things like cocaine, ecstasy, heroin, white, brown, use other terms like that. And when they would say those things to me, I would say, no, thank you, but I'm a researcher and here's what I'm doing. And as soon as I mentioned 50 euros, they were in. That was surprisingly successful. As I recall, only 2 people denied or rejected my request in terms of the street dealers, and only 3 robbed me. It was a pretty successful venture altogether. So what we found was, and this is in the first paper on the left, these are what my postprints look like on my site. What we found is that the street dealers were in line with the theory, more likely to be victimized than the bars, but unlike the theory, we actually found coffee shops were less likely to be victimized. So we expected the coffee shops to be in the middle, but it turned out they were being victimized less in several ways. And then in terms of retaliation and calling the cops, again, the street dealers were different. From this case, the bars and the coffee shops, with the bars and coffee shops being similar in their responses in terms of calling the cops versus retaliating. And I should be clear, retaliating in this context would be pretty broadly defined by physical force above touching someone on the elbow, but really, physically in a physics sense of moving them like an object out of your place, although it could also escalate to serious fights, throwing bottles and things like that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I've worked on this data and doing these other papers. So a recent one is on coffee shops and whether they decide to call the cops when victimized. I did a couple papers with my colleague Wim Bernasco at the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement, very long name. And that's just based on the street dealer data. I continue to work on this data slowly but surely. It's the kind of thing that I just can't get rid of in my life as much as I would like to. But currently I'm working on a paper, for instance, on coffee shops' toleration of victimization, which they tend to do quite a bit. So if you've collected data like this, maybe it's occurred to you a little ways into there that you get to this point where you're pretty sure you know what you're going to find. And I could tell, okay, I was pretty sure, and of course you got to wait for the stats. It was pretty clear to me that the coffee shops were going to be victimized less than the street dealers and less than the bars. And so I was thinking about why could that be? That goes against the theory that they have less access to law, and they will tell you. So there's some quotes to this effect in the mobilization paper I just talked about, the second paper, of they don't particularly want to call the cops, because if they call the cops, that can be a bad mark on the coffee shop, suggesting essentially they're a source of nuisance. So given that, how could it be that they're not being victimized as much as bars? They're not being victimized as much as street dealers. And so the obvious answer, and the one I'm not going to cover because it is fairly obvious, and I think literature not on coffee shops but drug use more generally will bear this out, that, okay, they're high and other people are drunk or coked up. And if you're high, you're less likely to victimize someone than if you're drunk or coked up. Yes, fair enough. I don't doubt that. I'm sure that's part of it. But there's also a more important part. Well, maybe I shouldn't say more important. There's certainly another significant feature to that. And that's what I'm going to get in today. But first, how did this come to my mind? Why did I start focusing on this? I never, prior to going to Amsterdam, particularly thought about preventing victimization. You'll think about it in terms of, okay, you're victimized. Do I retaliate? One reason I may retaliate is so that other people don't come and try to victimize me again. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to preventing any victimization from occurring in the first place, or preventing a different victimization totally unrelated from occurring later. And so at the same time, and these things started to go together with me, I started becoming interested in things like this. And so I can't see myself in the camera, but this is a little sign that would go on a table at the Bulldog, one of the chain coffee shops in Amsterdam. And you would see signs everywhere in coffee shops. So there was all types, some would list out everything like this. Others would be, and I'm just going to click through them, would list out, things that you're like, you're really going to make a rule on that. So you'll see in a second, no cell phones. You'll see no dogs. These rule signs just were everywhere you would go. And it wasn't the kind of thing like, oh, you would see these street dealers, right? They're not going to have a rule sign hanging from their neck, but you wouldn't see these in bars. You may see something such as you have to be 16 to come in, or you have to be 18 to be sold hard liquor. But it was nowhere near the prevalence of this in terms of the frequency across coffee shops, or also within any given coffee shop, the number of various rules they would display, how many places they would display them, and also outside the coffee shop. So some of these are pictures from outside the coffee shop. And so there was a very clear message being sent by these. This is one of my favorite, be polite, roll your joint inside. No headwear. So, and again, I'm going to go into this one in particular. One of the rules that if you're not accustomed to Amsterdam, and you show up there and you go to a coffee shop because you're very intellectually curious, you see this and you're like, that's kind of an overreach, is it not? I can't wear a hat. Why not? I can't wear sunglasses. Why not? And then, as I mentioned, the cell phones and the dogs and things like this. Now, this is a table, and I'm going to present a few tables based on the quantitative data. And all I want to show you here is that this is a table with the X showing that in the left here are various coffee shops, all are pseudonyms. And then, so another thing that I didn't mention before is in addition to the interviews, there were ample observations. So originally it was just me doing a lot of the observations and myself. I had to unfortunately go to coffee shops and hang out for hours on ends and do that in the bars and do that all around the 10-12. It was very difficult, but that's what I get paid to do. So one of the things we were doing, then later a group of, I did this with Danielle Reynolds, who's now at Griffith, and a group of students helped us out. was systematic social observations of every street segment. So that's what the map originally is from. Every street segment, every bar, and every coffee shop that participated in the study. And so, for example, what we see here is an X on every single coffee shop that had one of these particular kinds of rules, inside or outside. And you can ignore what government-based, not government-based any means at the time. But if you just focus on any, you'll see that all but a few of these coffee shops had a rule somewhere displayed. And again, if you did this in bars, I want to say, and I should have pulled that data up, it's something like 10, 20% versus 90%. Okay, so very different across these dealers in this. And so, although I went to Amsterdam for the victimization and the responses to victimization, what I wanted to first write about, because I don't think you can understand coffee shop victimization and responses to it and prevention more broadly without understanding the rules. And so what this book is about, published by UCL Press, and again, open access is really important. Don't have to buy the book. It's free at the UCL Press website, is just a focus on these rules. So how do coffee shop personnel and personnel as owners and employees, how do coffee shop personnel manage the rules in terms of, do they decide to obey them? Do they decide not to obey them? And what circumstances? How do they go about doing that? What are the difficulties? What are the motivations? Why do they sometimes want to do it but can't? All of these kinds of things. And so the book starts out, as will I, in terms of getting into really the meat of the presentation, is what is the Dutch coffee shop law or policy? Now, this confuses a lot of people, and especially my students, although that's not saying much. It's a crime to grow cannabis for anything but personal use. It's a crime to buy large quantities of cannabis. It's a crime to sell cannabis. And so at the time of my study, I don't know how different this is nowadays, you could be punished for doing those things with 6 years imprisonment or a fine of up to 67,000 euros. And so the deal was this, and maybe this is a good way to explain it. Coffee shops are said to be, this great example of toleration, but they're really not tolerated. They're highly regulated. To call them tolerated misses the point and shades things away that they're not. Coffee shops, more than bars, more than street dealers, are controlled. They're controlled differently, and they're controlled with these sorts of rules, not criminal punishments, but civil punishments. And I'll get into what the rules or what the punishment is for the rules in a second. But what are the rules? So there's these 6 rules, and what are the rules is slightly referred to different in policy documents. But for the sake of this study, I think this is the best way to do it. So you can't have more than 500 grams on the premise. Which is a good amount of cannabis, but if you have a lot of customers, it's not that much. And I won't go into this too much, but again, if you've been in a coffee shop and you've been in probably the more popular ones, if they have 20, 25 strains of weed and they have the most popular ones, but they want to keep them all in more or less equal amounts, if someone comes in and buys 5 grams of crazy name weed, I don't know, whatever it would be, and then someone else does the same, they're going to have to restock that weed, or they're going to have to decide not to make sales on that anymore. No advertising. That rule is much more nuanced than no advertising, but at its core is you cannot advertise that you sell cannabis. You can't sell more than 5 grams to a person in a day. You can't have minors on the premise. So to be clear, there's some funny quotes about this of parents bringing their kids and the personnel being like, there's no children allowed, and then being like, oh, it's okay, they're with me. No, it's not okay. There can't be any minors on the premise. No hard drugs. Technically, how I've seen no hard drugs is that you can't sell hard drugs, but at least in Amsterdam at the time, the rule had become interpreted both by the police and personnel alike as no hard drugs on the premise, period. And then no nuisance, which is a very vague concept, which is useful in that sense for social control. But mostly, I think the clearest way, the fairest way, for example, in Amsterdam at least, is to think about violence and aggression. So you could call it nuisance, you could call it crime, just things that don't fall in that category, but that the community wouldn't want to have around because of a coffee shop. So as I already talked about, and this is generally true not only of the rule signs, but rules like I just discussed. Bars have rules, Street dealers have rules in a way, like, so there will be extra punishment for selling to a minor in theory if you're a cocaine dealer. But in terms of regulation, clearly stated rules that, hey, you need to follow these rules or else. What we're talking about here is coffee shops. And so Geis gives a good a quote to this effect. There's no business like a coffee shop that has to stick to so many rules. The coffee shop owner has the most worries of every businessman, basically because you have so many rules. It's too much to comprehend sometimes. Now, what is the enforcement? So part of the Dutch law policy is that the police are supposed to randomly check every coffee shop at least 2 times a year. I asked the participants how many times they had been checked. Some actually said they had been checked less than 2 times in the prior 12 months, but on average, it was about 2.5 times. And so you'll see quotes like this. Luke said, when are the police coming? That's the only worry. And then Jacques said, you get a license and you agree to let the police in the door whenever they come. So you make sure you're doing nothing wrong ever. We get checked up on very regularly. We have far more checks on our business than any other sort of business in the country. We have police checking for all sorts of stipulations that they can shut us down for. You make sure you're on top of those things. We stay within the rules because we know how easy it is for them to shut us down, which leads nicely into the second part of enforcement. What is the punishment and how severe is it? So we're talking civil penalties here. In theory, something that goes on in the coffee shop could lead to criminal prosecution and punishment, although that never came up in my study. So let's just focus on the civil punishments. And in a second, I'll give you a sense of what you have to really keep in mind, and it's probably especially clear nowadays in the COVID era, is that when a business closes, that's not just a business closes. That means people are losing income. Employees are losing income, owners are losing income, the sale value of an establishment is going to go down, these sorts of things. And so we have these participants here saying, we love our shop, and we would be at risk of the coffee shop being closed down if we didn't follow the rules. These 7 people are out of a job, and I don't want that responsibility. It is not worth it. This is our job. This is our way of paying our living. You have to work, you have to pay your rent, you have to live. And so what they're both talking about is the motivation to make sure they're following the rules that I just covered. And then Jans points out that even if the coffee shop isn't punished, personnel have a more individualistic reason to be concerned about it. So he says, if they, referring to minors, are in there and the police come in on my fucking watch, I would be fired if the coffee shop is not closed down. So this is a table, and all I want to point out to you really is the average in the bottom. And that's to say, what I'm showing you here is the average coffee shop in the area had 10 employees. So if you're talking 50 coffee shops in the sample, that's 500. If you're talking 82, let's call it 80 in the population, you're talking 800 people who here on average are at risk of, if these rules don't get followed, the police come in, check them, and to be clear, that's what they do. They come in, they check everyone's IDs. They count if there's more than 500 grams they find. They look through the ledger to see how much has maybe been coming in and out. Are they paying taxes? The tax people come at the same time. Are there hard drugs? Is there anything, there's interesting stories of finding something the police consider an advertisement, and there being arguments over that. So that's what the police come in and check on. And so I just want to show you here kind of what's at stake for these individuals. And then the last thing here, or another table, again, in the last row, is just showing what is the annual profit. Call it, just over half a million euros. I would ask people, if the coffee shop were to go on sale, what would it be worth? There was some interesting disagreement about this at the time because of new policies coming into place, but call it just over €1 million. And then also the number of weekly customers, you can see shy of 1,000, and the number of weekly sales, because for instance, someone could buy 2 bags of weed, or they could buy a bag of weed and coffee. So just to give you kind of a sense of the economic environment that these people are operating in. So complying with the rules, and this is, of course, a key feature of criminology, especially from the offender perspective, is complying with the rules of the law more broadly is not, at no cost. There are negative consequences for following the rules. If you want to rob someone to take their money, not robbing them, in other words, following the law, has a consequence of you having less money in your pocket. Now that's obvious, but I want to point out how it works exactly in coffee shops. So if you can't have more than 500 grams, you can't advertise, you can't sell more than 5 grams, what's the consequence? You're going to make fewer sales, possibly, depending on your coffee shop, and you're going to have lower sales. So originally the coffee shop rule was they limited it to 30 grams per person per day, and then they changed it to 5. You would imagine that had an instant effect on their income, and that's just to show you these kinds of things can be manipulated. It's also possible that by keeping out minors and keeping out hard drugs, you're going to have fewer sales. If you'd rather sell to a 16-year-old and make more money, but you don't because of the rule, obviously you're losing income there. And then this is what I'll get into later on in the presentation, is there's time, there's effort, there's stress involved in complying with the rules. So especially the rules for minors, hard drugs, and nuisance, because unlike the 500 grams, unlike the advertising, unlike the 5 grams, these last 3 rules are not fully in control of the personnel. If a minor wants to walk into a coffee shop, in theory, the coffee shop could try to prevent that by putting someone at the door, but someone at the door is going to cost the coffee shop money, so they can't keep them out. And if a minor walks in and the police walk in right after him or her, that's the coffee shop's problem, and they are seriously punished for that. That's not just, oh, we understand by the police, that's your fault. So there's all kinds of time and effort and stress that goes into these kinds of things. And as I just said, there's also this balance of you want to follow the rules because that's going to keep the business open, but you also want to profit, and you also want to minimize your costs in terms of time, effort, and stress. So the question that is implicit in the personnel's mind is, how do you balance those benefits and costs optimally? Okay, so I'm going to look at that in 2 ways. One is the deterrent effect of the rules, and then I'm going to cover the proterrent effect of the rules. So deterrence, said in a simple way, is scaring people out of doing something bad. So absolute deterrence, there's 2 types of deterrence. One is absolute deterrence, the other is restrictive deterrence, which I'll cover in a second. Absolute deterrence is the rules are never broken. And this would be, for example, by a coffee shop, not necessarily a society, but by an individual, by an organization. So you have people saying that's what happens. So Sophie, my boss, is very strict. The owner, she is very strict. She does not want to break any rules. Amir, if police come in, they are always happy with us. Always, everything is perfect, always perfect. Sign, they give you rules and they are simple to follow. You would be very idiotic if you didn't follow the rules because the rules are simple. Now, restrictive deterrence is where the rules are broken sometimes. And I asked, personnel, each of these rules, did you have more than 500 grams? Did you sell to minors? Did you have minors on the premise? So on and so on. And some of them admitted to it, and I'm about to show you a figure, but they did, I would say, knowingly or not, and I'll talk about how that's plausible even when they're trying to be good participants, very likely underestimate the extent to which the rules are broken. But what this table shows you is admittances of breaking the rule. So again, I would ask them about each of the rule. Was it broken in the last 12 months? And if you see an X, that means they admitted to doing these rules. So you can see that the most common rule that's broken is sold more than 5 grams, followed by hard drugs, with advertising and nuisance being very similar. I didn't ask about the presence of minors because minors walk on, and in theory, I should have maybe split it up or done it the same with hard drugs. But minors, I mean, every coffee shop is going to have a minor walk into it and try to buy marijuana. You can just take that for granted. I would say the same for hard drugs. Every coffee shop is going to have hard drugs in the last 12 months. There is a degree of luck here of, does it get left on the floor? Does a police officer walk in and find it? Because 2 times to be randomly checked is a lot. On the other hand, it's an extremely small percentage of the days and certainly the hours and minutes in a year. So restrictive deterrence comes in 2 types, and I usually focus on the latter of these. So probabilistic, which is saying, for instance, my middle-class drug dealers would do this a lot. They would sell for, let's call it a year, and they would essentially feel, my time, I think, is running out, so I'm just going to stop. That would be an example of probabilistic restrictive deterrence, where they took their bet, they got out, they figured eventually their odds were going to run out. And you could also do that in a more day-to-day thing, like, I'm just not feeling my luck today. Any kind of like a gambler would do. And then particularistic, that's a tough word for me, techniques, is limiting the how. So it's useful to give an example of, so driving. This would be, for example, if you're going to speed, you speed on the highway when other people are speeding, and you don't speed on the highway when other people aren't around. Or if you're going to speed, you're in the fast lane, not in the slow lane. Or if you're going to speed, you do it at, whatever, maybe at night or not in the rain or things like this, where what you're calculating in your head is, okay, I'm going to do this, but only under certain circumstances that reduce the likelihood of me being caught and punished for doing that thing. So in any case, both of these fears at work, with the idea being that they reduce the bad behavior in question. So some examples of the latter here, and I'm going to go through 500 grams and then advertising and then minors and then move on to proterrence. So 500 grams, especially on busy days, Finn's talking here, especially on busy days like the Cannabis Cup. Sorry for not deleting that footnote. In November or New Year's Eve, we might stash an additional 200, 300 grams on site. The additional inventory that I need for logistical reasons on those days is harder to find for the police. And then Mike, and the boxes out of which the cannabis is sold. So if you go into a coffee shop, what they do, some of them would put it kind of in a, not a Ziploc container, but you know what I mean, a plastic container you would put food in. I'm just blanking on the term here. Something like that. And so anyways, he says there's always less than 500 grams. But for example, it happened in the past that they had it in the basement because the runner comes. So what happens is you have to guess what they're going to sell in half an hour so that he brings you all the weed you'll need. So what he's saying is you're projecting out, okay, we need another 100 grams currently to get to 500, but I think in the next 20 minutes before the runner can come, we'll sell another 10 grams. So bring 110 grams, don't bring 100 grams. So anyways, it goes on to say, if it becomes more than you end up needing, you have 510 grams in the coffee shop at that moment, for example. The first thing you do is take the 5 or 10 grams more into the basement or somewhere else, never put them in the boxes. It's like everything is hidden. And then one time at a coffee shop, I was hanging out at the bar, and again, I think these are possibly more common in Europe. You would see them in Amsterdam a lot, at least. And they were little mini vending machines that you would hang on the wall, and so you could get a lighter or some rolling papers or whatever it may be. And so I was sitting at the bar, and one of the personnel came in, trying to be very secretive about it, but clearly did a poor job. And he opened the box where you would open it with a key on the side, opened it, and where you would store the items at the top, there was also a blank space, a void underneath it. And he just wound up taking these containers I'm referring to out of a book bag and putting them into there. So why would you do that? You wouldn't do that because you're well within the 500 gram limit. That must have been their way of secretly just storing them within the near grasp. Coffee shop supply. All of this is in the book, just showing you, if you can take a quick glance down the max gram count, that most of them will have a limit where they say, we don't try to push it to 500 grams, we push it to 400 or 300 or 450 or 480. But you will see in this that some of them will go to the very max. They say 500 grams is what we go to. If a coffee shop says 500 grams, as far as I'm concerned, that means they break the rule. It's not recorded as such in the study, but that's the logical implication just because of the complexities of doing this day in and day out. And this is a daily thing with several coffee shops, or not even several, many coffee shops doing it multiple times a day. And then you'll see that some of these coffee shops admitted to going over 500, which would be reflected in the earlier table about breaking the rules. This isn't exactly a rule, but I thought it may be interesting. So including a quote over this. This is how they get their cannabis. And so Selma said, I don't take samples from Dutch men because I don't trust them. Quick piece of background. One of the things I found surprising that I hadn't expected is where they would get their cannabis from. It was logical that there would be, friends of friends or some kind of network. I wouldn't call it organized crime, but some kind of setup, some kind of business that's illegal. But actually a common practice there was people would grow for themselves, in their basement or in their attic or on their back porch, on their balcony. So someone where I lived across the way, they have, again, I don't know how popular these are in Europe. I feel like they're kind of Soviet style, but a square of apartments all the way around, and then a big garden space in the middle. And so right across from me, this guy was always growing a bunch of plants at the same time. And so what I heard from many coffee shops was people would take their plants and then they would, harvest them, they would let them dry, and then they would come in and try to sell them to coffee shops one by one. So they would say, I have these strains, are you interested? Give their information, and then they would get in touch that way, or the coffee shop would be like, no, I'm not interested. So anyways, I'm asking Selma about this. Who does she take samples from, and who doesn't she take samples from? So again, this is kind of the cost benefit of, okay, this is a bad thing to do, but what's the likelihood of getting in trouble for it? So Selma says, I don't take samples. They can be from police officers, undercover or something. These Dutch men, for example, and now she's getting into a concrete story. They were like in their 40s. They started coming in for 4 months and 4 months ago. They wanted to sell hash. I really didn't trust them. And then they were like, at one point, because we were talking for like 10 or 15 minutes, they were like, oh, let's have a cup of coffee. So they had a cup of coffee, and then he took this big block of hash out and started rolling a joint from it. And so for Selma to mean a big block of hash, you're talking a big block of hash. And then I knew he was not undercover, because you cannot walk in with a block of hash like that in your pocket. Nobody, even undercover police who try to catch somebody in a coffee shop, that is impossible. I told him, if you want to come, you can come at 5 o'clock and talk with my boss. So in other words, she doesn't trust Dutchmen. Generally, you'll see that in other quotes, for fear that they're undercover. But once they had proven to her in a way that they weren't undercover, she was fine with passing on their information. Advertising. So to lead into some pictures I'm about to show you, and this is where I don't use a pseudonym for Domkreen, which is also to say they may be in the study and they may not be in the study, because this particular conversation wasn't part of an interview, but rather just overhearing them while I was hanging out there one day. And I can't show you these pictures I'm about to show you without saying, well, this is an employee of the Domkreen. So in other words, the anonymous aspect of it here just doesn't apply. So in the back of our heads, the coffee shop name is on it, and all over the world, people know the name because of what they call the advertisement. But it's not an advertisement. This advertisement is allowed by law, and we stick to following the rules. So what is an advertisement? An advertisement, again, and I'm not sure if you can see me on the screen or how well, but this is another advertisement with the same back. And then I have the one pictured right here. And so if you just focus for a second on the left, what they've done here is they've put their coffee shop name, which is fine. They've put Amsterdam coffee, which means weed. And then they have someone, to make that extra clear, blowing smoke rings from their coffee cup. Now, this is on the very fringe of compliance with the advertising rule. I think if any reasonable person looked at this and they knew they were in Amsterdam, and then they read the part on the right, they realized Amsterdam coffee is just weak code for cannabis. But they were doing this. They made a big deal out of it. They did really good. So later they started doing these postcards, and I mean, they're really well done. And they would just hang these out, or hang them when you'd walk into the coffee shop, they'd be on the wall for people to take free of charge. And so this was their way of advertising, of getting people to take these. They'd bring them home. They'd be like, oh, isn't that cool? Their friends would learn about Domkreen. And then when they would go to Amsterdam, they would want to go to Domkreen too. And so what these advertisements did was they also combined, what did they call them? They called them, it's not the rules. It'll come to me in a second. But on the right side here, and these are again in the book, is don't drink Amsterdam coffee every day. Don't drink Amsterdam coffee if you're pregnant. Don't, make sure you consult your doctor before drinking Amsterdam coffee. And all of these kinds of things, where they were an interesting public service announcement, if you will. I don't know if that's a thing over there, but a public service announcement saying, hey, this is the way you should enjoy cannabis. No, I mean Amsterdam coffee. So it was very clear what was going on here. But again, to go back to this quote, the police had been there. The police were well aware of these, and they just decided that it wasn't a violation of the rule that you can't advertise cannabis. And so is it restrictive deterrence? Maybe not, because it really is not deterrence in a way at all. On the other hand, it's deterrence because if there wasn't an advertising rule, this guy would be holding a blunt or a bong or a joint or something like that, not just a coffee cup. So in that sense, it is. So let's see here. And then they became so, let's say, confident in what they were doing here that when they opened up a second dump crane, so at the time there was two dump cranes and then the Tweed Commer was their chain. They put this on the new dump crane, which is on that little street I mentioned earlier. That's not part of the 1012, but socially a part of it. I think it's fair to say in terms of it's close to the central station and so on. They put this on the side of the coffee shop. Now, how anyone would think this is not a cannabis advertisement, I don't know. But such is life. They got away with it. It's an interesting example of working within the rules or restrictive deterrence. So 5 grams on the front door. Again, recall this was probably the most, or it wasn't probably, was at least the most admitted rule that was broken, or you know what I mean. So Maud said 6 or 7 grams. This is how much she would sell. 6 or 7 grams, not more than that. Yeah, I've done it, but I don't take risks. I know they're not from the cops. Hannah said, depends what the people are like. People who are Dutch, I wouldn't do it, again, because they are suspicious that they're undercovers. Maybe they are from the police or something, or they go to the police. Observed incidents at coffee shop man in the bottle. So every morning, pretty much, certainly Mondays through Fridays, I would work out at a gym in the middle of Amsterdam in the 1012 very early. And then I would go and have my morning Amsterdam coffee at Man in the Bottle, and I would hang out with Selma. And so a lot of the things that I guess I shouldn't have seen, if you will, I saw there. And it was a fairly regular occurrence. They were also near the train station for employees from the train company, so stewardess or whatever it may be. People working on the trains would come in, they would buy way more than 5 grams each. They would put it in their bags, and then they would take it back to Paris or Brussels or Germany or wherever they were originally from. And then also, Selma told me, I also saw another story there where some guy came in and he had agreed to buy, it was like $200 worth of cannabis. It was like, and there was like trash bags being exchanged, and it was a whole thing. It wasn't as big as this last story here, where she goes, me personally, I did 400 grams. My boss told me, so I called her up, okay, you go get the stuff. You don't meet in the coffee shop. You meet by McDonald's, which was a couple blocks away. It's like 200 meters away from here. So I walked to this place, and there we exchanged the cannabis and money. I felt like a very wrong dealer, half a criminal. Of course, she's a full criminal, but let's leave that aside. All right. So complying with those rules, as I also mentioned earlier, is largely in the control of the coffee shops, if they're willing to do it. So I talked about putting a security guard at the door. If you want to put a security guard at the door, you can keep out minors, you can keep out street dealers, you can keep out people who look highly intoxicated. You can keep out, so hard drugs should be nuisance. You don't have to advertise. Oh, geez. So, okay, sorry, got messed up. So advertising 500 grams and 5 grams are in your control largely. There's some exceptions to that. The other 3 rules I'm about to look at are minors, hard drugs, and nuisance. And these are much more difficult for personnel to keep control over. If a minor wants to go in, again, unless there's a security guard, the minor is going to walk in. If someone wants to walk in with hard drugs on their person, they're going to do that. If someone wants to come in and start a fight, it's very difficult to stop them from doing that. All of those would technically be violations of the rules and punishable by the government. So again, I also just want to reiterate here that complying with these rules, there's not only, we need to comply with these rules, but this has to be balanced against how much time and effort and stress do we want to put in to enforcing these rules and keeping people out. So this is where we start talking about proterrence. And hopefully maybe if Michael's here or someone else could talk about indirect legislation, Bentham's idea of that, which I would consider proterrence to be the closest to. Indirect legislation is one of those things on my list that I need to spend a lot of time studying and getting into it. So hopefully someone can speak to that concept. I think it's certainly something that criminology, especially as it becomes more interested in regulation, should use and employ in our research. So what is proterrence? So whereas deterrence is scaring people out of doing bad things, I define proterrence as scaring people and stopping other people from doing bad things. So, for example, the rules motivate personnel to stop other people, such as minors, hard drug users, and fighters, from doing bad things on the premise. Those would be examples of proterrence. And so how proterrence is important in coffee shops in particular, Jans has a quote that alludes to this. Cannabis is still illegal in most of the world, so it's a little bit of a taboo thing. And they, the government, do feel that they have to regulate it more. So you get all these extra little rules because you've got this whole gray area thing. It leads to more control in the coffee shops themselves, and you should have staff who take care because you are playing with your license. So in other words, the coffee shops are highly regulated because of the legal ambiguity, the middle road here. That control in turn leads them to be more controlling of others, not only more controlling of themselves in order to stay open, have a job, have income, maybe be able to sell the business and so on. Deterrence and proterrence have the same kind of conceptual breakdown as far as I can tell. You could do it restrictively, you could do it absolutely, probabilistic, particularistic. All of those things should match up. I'm not going to focus too much on that at the time. So I'm going to go through now proterring minors, proterring hard drug possessors, and then proterring nuisance, and then wrap up and talk about how those relate to victimization, and then also how that relates to deterrence and rules and law more broadly. Let me check for time. So let me start focusing on what I really want to focus on here, which is that enforcing these rules. So what do? A lot of this isn't going to be surprising, so it's a good point to skip over things. Checking ID, okay? Yeah, obviously that's what you do to keep out minors. If someone doesn't have ID, what do? You tell them you got to leave. Coffee shops claim to ID everyone. In Georgia, it's actually a rule or a law that you have to ID everyone, which is very ridiculous for grandparents and things like that. But that's the law. That's not the law in Amsterdam. So when they say we check everybody, what they really mean is we check people who are young and we check people who we don't know already. So you can imagine if there's a 19-year-old that goes there all the time, they're not going to keep checking the 19-year-old. That's what they would do. What happens from this rule enforcement is interpersonal conflict with the people you're enforcing it against. So there's things like people walking in with fake IDs. There will be an argument about, yes, it's a fake ID, no, it's a fake ID, these kinds of things. And then Yana says, and this is a good quote to illustrate the point, I feel like a police person, you have to check everybody that comes in, like young kids that come in. That is also annoying. People that make problems about their ID. There is all this discussing, I just want to work, do my job. The same kind of thing applies with hard drug possessors. There's no equivalent to checking ID with hard drug possession. And so what these quotes are saying is we can't search people. If someone comes in and we think they have cocaine in their pocket or it's even plausible, we can't go into their pocket. We can't go into their bags. We don't know what people actually have, and therefore it's not a fair rule. Nonetheless, that's the rule. So what do? They look out for things like, Tom is saying they look kind of nasty. In other words, we think they're essentially homeless street dealers of heroin and cocaine. You also have people whose identity is known. Okay, we know that's a street dealer. We don't care if he's in a suit today. We know he's a street dealer. We're not letting him in. You have some more obvious examples like white powder under your nose, or if someone's really drunk, that comes in later in terms of, I'm sure I don't have to tell British people this. You get drunk and you do cocaine. Apparently that's a very British thing I learned in Amsterdam. And then other people would actually use drugs openly or ask the employees, do you know where I can find hard drugs? Which was a big problem that would lead to some interesting conflicts, often funny, but interesting. Funny in hindsight, at least. Another thing that I go into is discrimination. I can talk about this more if someone has any questions about it. But they come up with these house rules. So this gets to the hats and sunglasses. Effectively, what happened in many coffee shops in Amsterdam is they were getting patrons who had a particular style, and that particular style happened to be a hat and sunglasses. And so what they often wound doing to essentially motivate those people not to come inside was ban hats and sunglasses. There's other reasons to do that, but that was a common explanation that you found across coffee shops. And then it was not always applied. So around Cannabis Cup, They would let people wear hats. My prescription sunglasses, if I explained to them they were prescription, they'd let them be. There were religious exceptions and things like that. Again, interpersonal conflict is a consequence of proterrence. So Gwen says here of street dealers, they can have a big mouth, so you just tell them to shut the fuck up and they will go away. Max, on the hat thing, if you have a quarrel about anything at the coffee shop, it's really like with people who have to take off their hats. There are only a few people who want to make a fuss about it, but those are really the people that you don't want in. When they want to make a problem, I say, it's just my rule. That's how I want it. You can take it or leave it. And then Coffee Shop Directory is a website. And there's interesting quotes on there of people complaining, not understanding the rule. Like, why do I have to take off my hat? They were so rude about it and giving poor ratings. So at the time, this was pre-Yelp or very early in the years of Yelp. It was Coffee Shop Directory was where people would go to rate and share information and gossip. And then proterring nuisance. As I mentioned, nuisance is this vague concept, and probably the clearest way to think about it is violence and aggression. And there's a lot of stories of people trying to prevent nuisance, and then what happens is it leads to a fight. Something I want to point out here at the bottom is in terms of fighting and violence, it's 10 times more common at coffee shops, I think, for these kinds of things. And because I'm clearly running very short on time here, what the book concludes with is talking about the rules, interpersonal conflict, they go hand in hand. The rules, I'm pretty sure, prevent victimization. There's analyses. That paper is yet to be written. I should have added it. But if you control for the amount of preventive measures between bars and coffee shops, they have the same amount of victimization. It's only when you control for the amount of prevention. Now, the other hand, by engaging in these preventive acts, they're opening up conflict with people. So people will try to say, look, you can't do this. They'll get mad. And there'll be some kind of conflict. Now, on the one hand, and these are the quotes that we have up right now, someone will be like, no, I'm not leaving. And so they get pushed, thrown out the door, something more physical in certain circumstances, rarely, but in certain circumstances. Now, more generally, that also comes back to them in terms of you're trying to force someone to obey the rules, the government rules, the house rules more broadly, and they don't like that. And there's a lot of stories of, and this is the conclusion of the book, where, hey, please don't do X, and someone spits on you. Or, hey, you can't come inside because you look drunk, and you get slapped or hit in the throat real hard. Or you can't do this, and someone gets, all kinds of things like this. And so it's an interesting exception to prove the rule in that victimization, again, to the best of my ability, and the quantitative analyses will come on this, the reason coffee shops have less victimization is because they do more to prevent various violations as a matter of deterrence and proterrence. But those very acts, the proterrence acts, are the ones that wind up getting them victimized at all. So it's an interesting exception. I'm not sure if it's an exception that proves the rule, but it's an exception that proves the rule. And so these are the kinds of stories I just talked about in terms of people being victimized, violently victimized. So we're not just talking, there's other cases of throwing a brick through the window and stuff like that, but violent victimization. The last one's fairly funny, of telling this old guy, you need to leave because you're drunk, and he tries to take a swing at him, and he just laughs him off. Attempted assault, if funny. And then, of course, this applies with deterrence and conflict and crime more broadly. And this is where I'll end. People don't like having rules enforced against them. Some of us can accept that better than others, but probably very few of us enjoy the experience. We can understand the experience. We can empathize with the experience, but we don't like it. And some people are less capable for whatever reasons, either as a personality trait or maybe they've been drinking too much, of handling that. And so there's always going to be examples of deterrence, controlling people, trying to stop people from breaking the rules, breaking the law, that are going to lead to these kinds of conflicts and lead to these kinds of victimizations. So just a couple recent ones that we have, and these will change from month to month and year to year, is the police brutality and Black Lives Matter, and the protests, and then the COVID-19 and the wearing masks. People don't like being told wear masks. They get in a conflict, they fight in the grocery store over it, and sometimes that goes to fists. So that'll be it. I'm sorry for running long. I'm out of practice on my presentations, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.
Thanks very much, Scott. That was really interesting, Sorry, I'm getting an echo. Do I sound all right, Tim? Sorry, yeah. I think
you're all right now, yeah.
Okay, now, thank you. No, really fascinating. It's a pity Stephen Engelman's just left us, because he's thought and worked on Bentham's indirect legislation, and he has left a comment in the chat. He talks about toleration and regulation, and consider Bentham from the indirect legislation manuscripts. What you will not tolerate, you cannot regulate, in the context of a discussion of prostitution and venereal disease. I'm not. I would need to ask Stephen what exactly the relevance of that is. I suppose, I don't know. I suppose it means if you make it illegal, then you don't regulate it; you just stop it. But I knew Scott was going to mention indirect legislation in this context, and I had both for this reason and for another one. I did read indirect legislation in the Bowring edition, and what struck me is that it's a pretty ropey text. It starts off. It was just in the background is that it first appeared in Dumont's Traité de législation civile et pénale in 80 as an essay in that work published in 1802. Then it was translated back into English for the Bowring edition by Richard Smith, but based originally on Bentham's English manuscript. So Bentham wrote it in English in about 1780. It was then translated into French by Dumont, and then translated back into English by Smith. And Bentham starts off, or is made to start off, by saying that direct legislation is concerned with prohibiting and punishing, and indirect legislation is concerned with prevention. That to me doesn't make any sense, because punishment itself is concerned with deterrence. So I think I mean, and there seem to me to be all sorts of problems with that text in terms of the way it's organised. There was a transcript made, and there is back in the 1980s, late 1970s and early 1980s, an attempt was made to organise the text, and Fred Rosen was so dissatisfied with it that he put it on the shelf. So I haven't had chance to look at that, but I mean, it seems to me that the way Scott presented it in terms of proterrence did make much more sense of what Bentham means by indirect legislation. I mean, if you look at Bentham's general legal theory and what he sees as law, he says that a law is addressed to a certain group of people who you want to perform a particular sort of action. And it seems to me direct legislation is addressed to the people whose actions you want to alter or inhibit. And indirect legislation is to people, addressed to people you want to do something so that they inhibit someone else's actions. And that seemed to me to make much more sense in terms of proterrence. Now, whether that's what Bentham actually meant or not, we shall presumably find out when we actually get an authentic and authoritative text of indirect legislation, which we still don't have. But I mean, coming back to that point about rules, Scott. I mean, what struck me as well is the way in which there's sort of a mishmash of law, of various sorts. Thinking of law very broadly, because there's the law of the state, and then the sort of the law that the coffee shops themselves impose in their own little territory. And then, you know, the added complication of how the police interpret the law, and how the coffee shops sort of push it at the edges, if you like. And then you have people from foreign jurisdictions coming in and not really understanding what the local context is and seeing things from their point of view. You know, I'm not, you know, if I want to wear my hat, I'm going to wear it, without understanding that, you know, that law is that sort of local rule is directed against a certain community that is causing problems for the coffee shops. And yeah, I think if I went to Amsterdam and I would see a sign for a coffee shop, I would expect to get a latte there. maybe you can get lattes in these coffee shops, as opposed to drugs. But I'm just wondering about well, I've got several questions, but but it's related to the way that these sort of different laws interact. From what you say, it sounds like there is no legal source of supply for the coffee shops, and so even though the coffee shops themselves are tolerated, they're not supposed to have, and they're allowed to have 500 grams. They're also not allowed to have 500 grams. I mean, is that right? There's a sort of a conflict.
Yeah, that is correct. So two things. First, most importantly, they do sell lattes, and then yeah, you
Okay,
can't
all right
have
then.
yeah, so you're safe there. You have an excuse. And then number two, yeah, so literally when they walk, you know, imagine you're on a street and you walk through the door, it goes from fully prohibited to de facto legal. Um, and so this comes up a lot, and the book goes into this a little bit about, you know, the risk is for runners getting caught of, you know, they get in an accident on their bike and the police show up and then they find a lot of weed and stuff like this. So that whole back end is very mysterious, and it's unclear to me, even having spent so much time there, what exactly, you know, how the government actually sees that. And I think it's very, it's a kind of thing, a button or a lever, I guess, is what criminologists refer to it. If they don't like how something's going, they can pull that lever to change things. And otherwise, I mean, and that's just a guess. Again, I'm not really sure. But otherwise, it's left there. And it's my understanding they can't legalize it because of a UN convention. But when we start getting to these sorts of things, I start going beyond my expertise in terms of just like offender decision making, if you will, and getting into the real law of, you know, just reading other people's things. And that's the argument I've seen, and that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's even another level of international law on top of state law, and I mean, sort of bringing it back to Bentham, that's exactly the sort of situation which he would wholeheartedly criticise, and in fact does so in Of the Limits of the Penal Branch of Jurisprudence, where he talks about, you know, one of the key things is for the legislature to make sure that the law is, you know, consistent with itself, and so it's difficult otherwise to you're sort of living in a lawless situation. In a sense, there is law there, but if there's two laws which contradict each other, then someone presumably has the ability to choose which law to apply in which circumstances, and that's arbitrary power. But it seems like there has, on the other hand, been a sort of a modus vivendi worked out in the Amsterdam coffee houses, where like I say, you were sort of a bit ambiguous about whether it's toleration or quite, or regulation, or what it is. But there Yes, you know the rules about 500 grams and no advertising. Where do those rules come from? I mean, who has imposed those rules?
It's a Dutch policy, and then the municipalities decide on their own whether they want to allow coffee shops, and if they do, then they enforce those rules.
Right. Okay. So there's primary sense state legislation which contradicts international legislation, but which allows local authorities. Right, okay. Sorry, I should stop. I should draw in other people who might have comments. Anyone else for questions or comments? Just, Tim Causer. Tim.
Yes.
Sorry, we can't hear your mic's off.
Good. Sorry, it was a bit of a delay there. That was great, Scott. Thanks very much. I was just wondering about the role of public opinion in all this. And do the views of the wider community around the coffee shops have any bearing upon how rigorously proterrence is applied? Like if a coffee shop is the site of notorious for being particularly violent or for selling hard drugs, does public opinion bear down on that as well?
So a couple things come to mind on that. And so one, and this is what the criminologists would always say, is there was a selection effect here of this has been going on for a long time, and by now the bad coffee shops have been closed. The notorious organized crime coffee shops, I'm sure they exist in places, but they've been weeded out over a long time, and so you would see that happen through these kinds of rules. You also saw that a lot, and you may recall this was at the time I was there of a lot of the international drug trafficking that's attributable to coffee shops is on the border. So someone pops over the border from Germany or France or Belgium, grabs their weed and goes back home and sells it. So that became a form of nuisance, in that you had all these tourists there who were only there, not to go to the various museums and all that, but they were literally there to get their weed and go home. And so that became a problem. And so that was back at the time they started doing licensing and things like that. So nuisance was particularly a problem in those kinds of spots. And this gets to where you're never really sure, especially in a government system where people vote and the Dutch system I like a lot in terms of how they have to work together compared to the two-party system. But the people who were in power at the time, if you go to the red light district today, it's totally different than it used to be. I mean, it's much cleaner, far fewer coffee shops, if any, in a certain area because of a school regulation. And so on an individual basis, my guess, and this is just a guess, you would have to interview police and things like that, is my guess is there were coffee shops that had 10 police checks. There were kind of funny exceptions because the reason they had so many is they were across the shop. And so let's say you two went to the police station as dignitaries or something, and you want to see how it works, they would bring them to this coffee shop. And so there was police there on a monthly basis. But you can imagine very well that if a coffee shop's getting a bad reputation, that they just start checking more. And they were known, and coffee shops would mention that the first thing you do after they leave is make sure for the week after you're full and tidy, on the assumption that if they think you're stupid, they'll go right back because they'll just drop off. More generally, I think that answered your questions as far as I remember what it was. Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Scott.
When I didn't sort of fully taking what you were saying about the sort of the profitability of the coffee shops, but you reckon there's about 800 people employed, and we saying they were making €500,000. Sorry. So I was just saying, would you I mean, what how big is the business? In other
As
words,
I mean, as I recall, it's 10 personnel for sure. And as I recall off the top of my head, without daring to go back in the slides and messing this all up, um, it was something like 100,000 profit a year. And then if they were trying to sell the business, and not everyone agrees on whether you can even sell those businesses, was like 500,000 euros, to
right?
just get out of it. But it was unclear if you can sell your license, and I think my understanding is you can't. Although plausibly the coffee shop that takes over should be able to get it back, but the government could then say no, in which case you're kind of $500,000 because blah blah blah. So yeah, I mean not a huge amount of money, but significant when you're talking small businesses, which is what they are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so there's quite an incentive to keep operating. In other words, and so there is sort of the money. I was thinking these proterrence measures. There is resources there to implement them, and in a sense, if they're not making money, it's their own sort of fool fault, really. And so I mean, how much do people? If you were buying 5 grams of drugs, what would you pay in the coffee shop?
It could be 6 or 7 euros for something real low grade. I also have all these stats in the
Yeah,
book as I went through them on various websites and menus and did all of this. But you could pay like 22 euros for a gram or something. But you're talking 10 euros a gram at a time. 12 euros a gram was
right.
was pretty normal.
And would the street dealers charge less?
I think that the street dealer business in cannabis was interesting because they would, and there wasn't a lot of it that I came across because they were mostly in the hard drugs or fake hard drugs. Um, but who would they sell to? They would sell to people who couldn't buy from coffee shops, which would be minors. Um, and then they would sell larger quantities than 5 grams. And as I recall, I don't think I had much information on this, and so certainly not quote me on this, but as I recall, the prices were equivalent. It was just a different type of clientele.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And um, I, I mean, in terms of, you know, I mean that's I presume that's clearly illegal. That and I mean, was it that the police ignored them, or again, did they just tolerate the
No, the street dealers
street
was a
deals?
big deal. I mean, I'm sure they had no choice but to tolerate them at the really busy times in the red light district where you have, the streets are just packed and there's so much going on, and they're probably more worried about violence and um, things of that nature. But no, again, the red light district now is totally different. So I've gone there a couple summers since to look around and write and think about what's going on there. And every time it's less and less. And I'm sure if we went there today, Americans aren't allowed into Europe right now, and I don't blame you. But when I can go there, in 2022, I imagine there won't be any. And like it became increasingly difficult, even the time I was there, to find participants because the police were making clear that that wasn't something they wanted around there anymore.
Okay, right.
So it was a different time. This had changes year in year out, and
Yeah,
it was kind of a free for all. It's my understanding in the '80s, and now it's been a trajectory the opposite direction.
right. Whereas in the United States, there's sort of been a movement in the other way to, at least in certain states, to make soft drugs more sort of more acceptable. I mean, I wonder what in a sense what Bentham's attitude would have been to the drug trade more generally. I mean, it seems to me a utilitarian approach would be to nationalise in a sense the drug trade and undercut criminal activity by just selling the stuff in government shops, growing it by government. I mean, this is never going to happen, but it would be a sort of it would be indirect legislation in a sense, in that you instead of saying to people you can't buy or sell drugs, or that well, you know, you can sell them through government shops, and that would therefore stop the crime that's involved in people raising the cash in order to buy the drugs. I mean, I know this isn't the Amsterdam coffee shop scene, where I guess most of the people who go in there are quite, you know, relatively wealthy, aren't going to commit crime, and, you know, decide to spend their money on recreational drugs. But I mean, what's your sense of sort of dealing with the drug problem generally? And that might be a question to close with.
I mean, yeah, it's a very difficult issue, and I have to say, I never thought that drugs would become marijuana would become as legal as it has been in the United States. So that goes to show that I'm often wrong. What I was wondering is, I know Bentham enjoyed a glass of wine, and I recall there's an example of someone's like house burning down from being drunk or something like that he wrote about. Maybe I'm just making that one up. I can't recall what it is, but did he write about alcohol law and policy or anything like that? Because that would be the logical just extension.
Yeah. I mean, I think he gave up alcohol later in life, but he used to like his tea. Sensible chap, but he does use drunkenness as an example of self-harm, really, but also one of these examples of a miscalculation, in that you get a certain amount of pleasure from the alcohol, but overall it causes you more pain. So it's not it's not prudent to get drunk, and so he condemns it from that point of view. But he doesn't have, as far as I know, anything to say about sort of regulation of alcohol. And of course, if people commit offences under the influence of alcohol, then they would be prosecuted or punished for the offence. You know, the alcohol would not be regarded as an excuse, like it, you know, sometimes it is regarded. And I mean, the only example that I can think of burning houses down is where I think he says, you know, it would be strange to allow someone to burn a neighbour's house down in order to cook his eggs, is, you know, something like that. Yeah, so I mean, I always think of sort of John Stuart Mill, where he talks about this is in On Liberty, the sale of poison, and he says there that you know, you shouldn't prohibit people from buying poison, you know, because there are legitimate uses for it, but that it should be sold through particular outlets and a register taken of the names of people who buy it. And then you would obviously need some sort of ID. Bentham's solution being tattoos. We could all be tattooed with our identity. So you know, there wouldn't be a problem with ID then in the Amsterdam coffee shops, in that we would all, you know, carry around our own ID tattooed into our arms or whatever. And so it's, you know, it's always struck me that, you know, John Stuart Mill's idea about the way in which poison was sold could be applied to the selling of drugs. And I was always struck by going into, this is back in the 1980s in Canada, going into the government shops for selling alcohol, which, you know, there are no advertisements. They seem very sort of Spartan establishments. There was no fuss. And it seemed a very, in a sense, controlled way in which to sell alcohol. And, you know, it was the government was making the profit from it. Which could then be used to lower taxes. So that seemed to have a lot going for it, but I think they've scrapped that in Canada at some point. Sorry, that was a long waffle, and I don't. If there are any other questions or comments, in other words, well, all I'll say is that in relation to your first remark, Scott, about having sex with Bentham's bones, you probably read Bentham's writings on sexual morality, and it's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. But anyway, I'll just let me finish by thanking you for. I thought that was a really fascinating talk, and you know, but and thanks for sharing it with us. And we also look forward in due course to the book on Bentham and police, and let's hope we can get indirect legislation sorted out sooner rather than later. So thanks a lot, Scott. Thank you.
No, thanks for having me, and thanks those of you that were able to join.
Thank you. And are you you're